My sister Brinley thought she could hide her past forever, tucked away in the ammunition storage of a Navy aircraft carrier. But when Admiral Fletcher caught sight of the medal, she desperately tried to conceal beneath her uniform. Everything she'd built came crashing down in ways none of us could have imagined. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. I need to tell you about my sister, because what happened to her changed not just her life, but the lives of everyone who knew her story. Brinley Cortez was 24 when this happened, 2 years younger than me, and she'd been serving as an aviation ordnance man aboard the USS Gerald Ford for 8 months. For those who don't know military life, that means she spent her days handling some of the most dangerous weapons and ammunition on one of the most powerful warships in the world. But here's what made Brinley different from every other sailor on that carrier. She wasn't running towards something when she joined the Navy. She was running away from something so devastating that our entire family still didn't know the full story, even 2 years after she enlisted. Growing up in small-town Nebraska, Brinley and I were inseparable despite being complete opposites. I was the cautious one, always thinking 3 steps ahead, while she was the type of person who would jump into a freezing river to save a drowning dog without a second thought. Our father, retired Army Sergeant First Class Diego Cortez, used to say that Brinley had the biggest heart and the smallest sense of self-preservation of anyone he'd ever met. Dad had always encouraged both of us to consider military service. He believed it would give us structure, purpose, and the kind of unbreakable bonds that only come from serving something bigger than yourself. I chose college instead, but Brinley enlisted right after high school, driven by something none of us could quite understand at the time. She completed her initial training with honors, excelled in her specialty school, and seemed to be thriving in military life. But when she got her orders to the USS Gerald Ford, something changed. The sister who used to call home twice a week, sharing every detail of her day, suddenly became a stranger who spoke in military jargon and deflected every personal question. Her shipmates knew her as someone who was incredibly competent at her job but kept to herself almost obsessively. She had this reputation for being meticulous with ammunition handling, never making mistakes, never cutting corners, and never socializing with her fellow sailors. In the tight-knit community of a Navy ship, this kind of isolation was unusual and concerning. What none of us knew at the time, what I only learned months later when I pieced together her story from the sailors who served alongside her, was that Brinley was carrying a secret so heavy it was slowly destroying her from the inside out. Every day, she would wake up in her tiny bunk, put on her uniform, and carefully arrange her clothing to make sure nothing showed that shouldn't show. She had developed this ritual of checking and double-checking her appearance, not out of vanity, but out of absolute terror that someone might discover what she was hiding. The irony wasn't lost on any of us later. Here was my sister, working in one of the most dangerous jobs on the ship, surrounded by explosives and weapons that could level a city block. But the thing that scared her most was a small piece of metal and ribbon that she kept locked away in her personal effects. You see, Brinley wasn't just another sailor trying to do her job and get home safely. She was a decorated combat veteran carrying survivor's guilt so severe that she'd rather risk her career, her safety, and her sanity than face the truth about how she'd earned that decoration. But Admiral Fletcher was the kind of officer who noticed things other people missed. He had this reputation throughout the fleet for genuinely caring about his sailors, not just as military assets, but as human beings. He'd served for over 30 years, commanded ships in 3 different conflicts, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot when one of his people was struggling. The day everything changed started like any other day aboard the USS Gerald Ford. Brinley woke up at 05:30, went through her careful morning routine, checked her reflection one more time to make sure her secret remained hidden, and headed to her duty station in the ship's weapons department. She had no idea that within 12 hours, her carefully constructed walls would come crashing down, and the metal she'd spent 2 years trying to hide would become the key to saving not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who were carrying similar burdens in silence. To understand what happened to Brinley, you need to know who she was before the Navy changed her. We grew up in Beatrice, Nebraska, population 8,000, where everyone knew everyone and secrets were impossible to keep. Our house sat on Maple Street, 3 blocks from the high school where both our parents taught. Mom was the chemistry teacher who made learning fun, and Dad taught ROTC while working part-time at the hardware store. Brinley and I shared everything growing up. We built blanket forts in the living room during thunderstorms, practiced shooting basketball in the driveway until dark, and spent summers riding our bikes to the reservoir where we'd fish and talk about our dreams. She wanted to travel the world and help people. I wanted to become a nurse and stay close to home. Even then, she was the brave one and I was the practical one. Dad's military stories fascinated her more than they did me. He'd tell us about his deployments, the soldiers he'd served with, and the importance of taking care of each other. Brinley would sit on the floor by his chair, completely absorbed, asking questions about leadership and courage. Dad always said she had the heart of a warrior, but he worried about that same heart getting her into trouble someday. When she enlisted at 18, right after graduation, our whole family was proud but terrified. Basic training letters came regularly, filled with her usual enthusiasm and determination. She wrote about her drill sergeants, her fellow recruits, and how much she loved the challenge of pushing herself beyond what she thought possible. Those letters sounded exactly like the Brinley we'd always known. But something shifted during her first deployment. The letters became shorter, less personal, more focused on routine details about military life. When she called home, which became less frequent, she sounded different. Her voice had this careful quality, like she was measuring every word before saying it. Dad noticed it first. After one particularly brief phone call, he told Mom, "Something's changed with our girl. She's not telling us something important." Mom tried to reassure him, saying that military service changes everyone, that Brinley was just growing up and becoming more independent. The last time we saw her before she shipped out to the Gerald Ford, she came home for a 2-week leave. She looked fit and confident in her uniform, carried herself with new authority, but there was something missing from her eyes. The spark that had always made Brinley so magnetic, so alive, seemed dimmed somehow. She spent most of that leave sleeping late, taking long walks alone, and avoiding places where she might run into old friends from high school. When I asked her about it, she just said she needed time to decompress from her deployment. At the time, that seemed reasonable. The night before she left for the carrier, she sat on my bed like we used to when we were kids. For a moment, I thought she might tell me what was really going on. Instead, she hugged me tighter than she ever had before and said, "Take care of Mom and Dad for me, okay? And if something ever happens to me, make sure they know I love them." I should have pressed harder. I should have known that wasn't just typical military caution talking. That was my sister saying goodbye to the person she used to be. What I learned later, through conversations with her shipmates and official records I wasn't supposed to see, was that Brinley was living with a secret that was slowly killing her from the inside out. Hidden in her personal locker, wrapped in a towel beneath her civilian clothes, was a Silver Star medal with a citation that told a story she couldn't bear to remember. The medal came from her deployment to Syria, where she'd served as part of a humanitarian mission providing security for medical aid workers. Her best friend, Private First Class Tessa Hawthorne, had been assigned to the same unit. They'd become inseparable during training, two small-town girls who found strength in each other while navigating the complexities of military life overseas. On March 15th of that deployment, everything changed. Brinley and Tessa were escorting a medical team to a school that had been converted into a makeshift clinic for local children. Intelligence reports indicated the area was secure, but an improvised explosive device had been planted in the building's foundation. When it detonated, the structure began collapsing with 7 children still trapped inside. Brinley made a split-second decision that would haunt her forever. She could see both the children and Tessa, who had been thrown against a wall by the blast and was calling for help. The building was coming down fast, and there wasn't time to save everyone. Brinley chose to rescue the children, pulling each one to safety while listening to her best friend's voice growing weaker under the rubble. By the time she got the last child out, Tessa was gone. The official report stated that Private First Class Hawthorne died instantly from her injuries, but Brinley knew better. She'd heard Tessa calling her name, asking for help, right up until the moment the ceiling gave way completely. The Army awarded Brinley the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism in saving 7 lives under enemy fire. What the citation didn't mention was that she'd been having nightmares every single night since it happened. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Tessa's voice. Every time she handled ammunition on the carrier, the metallic sounds reminded her of the debris falling around them that day. Brinley had never reported the medal to her current command because explaining it would mean reliving that day, and she couldn't do that. She'd been self-medicating with alcohol smuggled aboard during port visits, hiding bottles in maintenance spaces and drinking herself to sleep to avoid the dreams. Her work performance was still flawless, but Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez had started noticing small things. Brinley would freeze for just a second when certain equipment made specific sounds. She'd volunteered for extra shifts to avoid sleeping. During ammunition transfers, she'd sometimes grip the safety rails a little too tightly, her knuckles turning white. The breaking point came during a routine weapons loading exercise. When a pneumatic tool made a sharp metallic bang, Brinley dropped to her knees, covering her head with her hands. She was back in that collapsed school for 30 seconds, hearing Tessa's voice, before she snapped back to reality and realized her entire work crew was staring at her. Chief Rodriguez pulled her aside afterward and said, "Cortez, I don't know what's going on with you lately, but you're walking a fine line. One more incident like that and we're going to have a serious conversation." That night, Brinley sat in her bunk knowing her time was running out. 3 days after the incident with Chief Rodriguez, everything Brinley had been trying to prevent finally happened. Admiral Fletcher was conducting his monthly inspection of crew quarters, something he did personally rather than delegating to subordinates. He believed that walking through the spaces where his sailors lived and slept gave him insights into morale and welfare that reports couldn't capture. Brinley was on duty in the weapons bay when the inspection began. She'd been extra careful that morning, making sure her bunk was perfectly squared away and her personal items were properly stowed. What she didn't account for was the ship's ventilation system. The constant air circulation had gradually worked one corner of the towel loose from around her hidden metal case. When Admiral Fletcher opened her locker for the routine inspection, a single ribbon caught his eye. Just a sliver of red, white, and blue fabric, but unmistakably military. As a career officer who'd served for over 30 years, he recognized it immediately as part of a Silver Star ribbon. He carefully moved the towel aside and found the metal case, along with the official citation and a small bundle of personal items that included a set of dog tags that didn't belong to Brinley. The dog tags read Tessa M. Hawthorne. Along with them was a letter, creased from being folded and refolded countless times, and a photograph of 2 young women in military uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera. Admiral Fletcher didn't open the letter or read the citation in detail, but he'd seen enough. He carefully replaced everything exactly as he'd found it and continued his inspection as if nothing had happened. But that evening, he made several phone calls to contacts and personnel records and previous commands. When Brinley returned to her quarters after her shift, she knew immediately that someone had been in her locker. The towel wasn't positioned exactly the way she'd left it. Her hands shook as she opened the case and saw that while everything was still there, it had been moved slightly. Someone had discovered her secret. Panic set in first. Her mind raced through possibilities. She could throw everything overboard during the next watch. She could confess to Chief Rodriguez before anyone else found out. She could request an immediate transfer or even go AWOL at the next port of call. But as she sat on her bunk holding Tessa's dog tags, something shifted inside her. For the first time in 2 years, she heard her friend's voice differently in her memory. Not the desperate calls for help from that final day, but something Tessa had told her months earlier during a quiet moment between patrols. "Bryn promised me something," Tessa had said. "If anything happens to either of us over here, promise the other one won't waste time feeling guilty about it." We both knew what we signed up for. We're here to help people, and sometimes that means taking risks. Don't let survivors' guilt destroy the good you can still do in the world. That night, Brinley made the hardest decision of her military career. Instead of running or hiding, she cleaned her uniform, practiced what she would say, and prepared to face whatever consequences were coming. She owed Tessa that much. She owed herself that much. The next morning, she reported to Admiral Fletcher's office and requested to speak with him privately. When Brinley knocked on Admiral Fletcher's office door at 800 the next morning, she expected to face a disciplinary hearing that would end her naval career. Instead, she found herself sitting across from a man who had already spent hours researching her service record and making phone calls to people who knew her story. "Petty Officer Cortez," Admiral Fletcher began, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Before you say anything, I want you to know that Master Sergeant Kevin Hawthorne and I served together in Afghanistan 15 years ago. When I discovered your connection to his daughter, I called him last night." Brinley's carefully prepared speech died in her throat. She hadn't spoken to Tessa's father since the memorial service. Couldn't bear to face the man whose daughter she felt she'd failed to save. Admiral Fletcher continued, "Kevin told me something I think you need to hear. He said that Tessa's last letter home, written 2 days before the incident, mentioned how proud she was to serve alongside someone with your heart. She wrote, and I'm quoting directly, 'Brinley Cortez is the kind of person who would die for strangers. I'm lucky to call her my friend, and I know that if anything happens to me over here, she'll make sure it means something.'" The words hit Brinley like a physical blow. For 2 years, she'd been carrying the weight of believing she'd chosen strangers over her best friend. Now she was learning that Tessa had not only understood the choice she might have to make, but had respected her for being the kind of person who would make it. "Sir, I need to tell you what really happened that day," Brinley said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, you don't," Admiral Fletcher replied firmly. "I've read the official reports. I've spoken with your commanding officers from that deployment. I know exactly what happened, and I know that 7 children are alive today because of your actions. What I want to understand is why you've been carrying this medal like it's a burden instead of wearing it like the honor it represents." For the first time since Syria, Brinley told someone the complete truth. She described the sound of Tessa calling her name while she pulled children from the rubble. She explained the nightmares, the guilt, the way every metallic sound on the carrier brought her back to that collapsing school. She admitted to the drinking, the isolation, and the growing certainty that she didn't deserve to survive when Tessa didn't. Admiral Fletcher listened without interruption, then shared his own story of surviving an ambush in Vietnam where 3 of his Marines didn't make it home. "The hardest lesson I learned," he said, "was that honoring the dead doesn't mean suffering with them. It means living fully enough for both of us." He stood up and walked to his desk, returning with a folder. "Kevin Hawthorne asked me to give you something. Tessa left instructions that if anything happened to her, her personal effects should go to the person who meant the most to her military service. That person was you." Inside the folder was Tessa's final letter, addressed to Brinley, explaining her pride in their friendship and her certainty that Brinley would continue making a difference in the world. The transformation in Brinley didn't happen overnight, but it was unmistakable. Within a week of her meeting with Admiral Fletcher, she'd connected with the ship's chaplain and begun attending counseling sessions. For the first time since Syria, she started talking about Tessa not as the friend she'd failed, but as the hero who had trusted her to make impossible choices. Admiral Fletcher arranged a video call between Brinley and Master Sergeant Hawthorne. I learned about this conversation later when she finally called our family and told us everything. Tessa's father looked at her through the screen and said, "I've been waiting 2 years to thank you personally. My daughter died knowing that her best friend was the kind of person who would save children even when it meant losing everything else." That knowledge gave her peace in her final moments. The guilt that had been crushing Brinley for 2 years didn't disappear, but it transformed into something she could carry with purpose instead of shame. She began wearing her silver star on formal occasions, not as a celebration of her own actions, but as a reminder of Tessa's sacrifice and the children whose lives had meaning because of it. More importantly, she discovered that her experience could help other sailors dealing with similar trauma. She started volunteering with the ship's peer support program, and word spread quickly that Petty Officer Cortez was someone who understood what it meant to carry impossible burdens. Sailors began seeking her out during off-duty hours, sharing their own stories of loss, guilt, and survivor's syndrome. When she finally called our family to tell us the whole truth, Dad cried for the first time I could remember. Not because he was disappointed, but because he was proud of the daughter who had found the courage to save lives and then found even more courage to save herself. Mom immediately started researching military counseling programs, convinced that Brinley had found her true calling. The real test came 6 months later. A young sailor named Petty Officer Martinez was found on the ship's deck at 3 in the morning, standing at the rail, staring down at the dark ocean below. When the watch found him, he was holding a bottle of pills and talking about how he couldn't live with what had happened during his last deployment. Brinley was called to the scene because she'd become the unofficial counselor for sailors in crisis. She sat with Martinez for 4 hours, sharing her own story and listening to his. By dawn, he had agreed to seek professional help, and the pills had been safely disposed of. Martinez later told Admiral Fletcher that talking to someone who understood survivor's guilt had literally saved his life. That incident made Brinley realize that Tessa's sacrifice was still saving lives, just in ways neither of them could have imagined that day in Syria. Every person she helped carry their burden was another life her friend had saved through her. When I visited the carrier last month, Brinley took me to a small memorial corner she'd created in her workspace. Tessa's photograph sat alongside pictures of the 7 children from Syria, now grown and thriving in their new lives. She told me, "I used to think that medal was proof that I failed Tessa. Now I know it's proof that her sacrifice meant something, and that it keeps meaning something every day I choose to help someone else." That's when I knew my sister had finally found her way home.